village of Street Aldhelms had always been proud of its punctuality. Church bells rang with reliable dignity. Shopkeepers opened their doors at the same well-swept hour, and the evening lamps flickered into glow with a sense of ritual, as if the entire place were wound up like a clock each morning by some unseen hand. It was therefore all the more shocking when, at 11:30 on a moonless night, Mrs. Emmeline Prowse, the widow who lived in the high-gabled house on the green, was seen at her bedroom window standing very still, her face pale in the lamplight, and then, moments later, vanished from sight. It was not the sight of her at the window that caused alarm. Mrs. Prowse had long been a figure of curiosity, often pacing her rooms late into the night, her silhouette lit faintly against the curtains. What unsettled the village was what came after: the crash of glass, the sudden barking of dogs, and, by morning, the grim announcement that Mrs. Prowse was dead. The body had been found in her own parlour, slumped near the hearthrug, a scatter of broken china at her feet. By breakfast time, the news had spread across every hedgerow and teacup. Miss Lillian Harcourt, busy arranging flowers for the vicarage, declared that she had always said something dreadful would happen in that house. Old Mr. Penhaligon, polishing the brass scales in his shop, muttered that widows with too much money and too few visitors were bound to attract trouble. And Mrs. Bartlett, who sold bread rolls by the dozen, insisted it was a burglary gone wrong. Miss Marple, seated quietly in her rose-pink drawing-room with a neat tray of toast and marmalade, listened to the morning gossip carried in by her maid. Her expression betrayed nothing more than a faint lift of the brows. "Strange," she murmured softly, buttering the edge of her toast with patient precision. "Very strange indeed. People are rarely at their windows at that hour unless, of course, they are waiting for someone." Outside, the September air carried the mingled scents of damp leaves and coal smoke. Behind lace curtains and hedges clipped into neat obedience, speculation rippled through the village. But in one mind alone, the quiet, sharp mind of Miss Jane Marple, there had already begun the smallest stirrings of unease, a puzzle forming, the edges faintly visible in the shadows of a midnight window. By mid-morning, the village had fully awakened to its scandal. Prowse's house, normally shuttered and discreet, now stood open to the curious eyes of neighbors, as the constable moved in and out with awkward gravity. The widow had always been considered respectable if somewhat aloof, her fortune inherited from a late husband who had owned several mills in the north. Though she kept largely to herself, she was known to pay her church dues on time and to offer an occasional sovereign for parish causes. That she should meet her end so suddenly and so strangely was enough to set every tongue wagging. Miss Harcourt, still in her flower-trimmed hat, was heard whispering in the grocer's that she had seen a shadow pass across the widow's window before the crash. Tall. Not at all like her, she insisted, though others argued it must have been a trick of light. Meanwhile, Mrs. Bartlett confided to anyone who would listen that she had sold a fresh loaf to Mrs. Prowse just that very afternoon. She looked anxious, she declared, as though someone had been troubling her. But when pressed on what precisely seemed wrong, Mrs. Bartlett could offer nothing more than a dramatic sigh. At the vicarage, Reverend Chalmers expressed his sorrow in solemn tones, but his wife could not resist pointing out that Mrs. Prowse had once quarreled bitterly with a cousin over the matter of an inheritance. Family disputes, she said knowingly, have a way of lingering, even across decades. Others remembered, with relish, the occasional visits from a gentleman of military bearing no longer seen about for some months, and speculated wildly on what connection he might have had to the tragedy. Through it all, Miss Marple remained serenely attentive. She walked to the churchyard as though merely admiring the roses, yet her sharp eyes took note of every anxious glance exchanged at doorsteps, every hurried attempt to lower a voice when footsteps passed by. She knew well the way human beings behaved when fear lay close at hand. Guilt, too, had its particular signatures. At the widow's gate, she paused politely, nodding to the constable, who was attempting to look both official and competent. while scribbling in his notebook. "Sad business, isn't it, Constable Pritchard?" she remarked, her tone mild, almost grandmotherly. "I suppose one might call it a burglary, but then again, burglars are not in the habit of smashing china when they can as easily take it, are they?" The young man flushed and muttered something about routine procedures. Miss Marple simply inclined her head, as though nothing more had been said, and strolled on. Yet within her mind, threads were already weaving together. The widow at her midnight window, the sound of glass, the broken china, and the whispers of quarrels and suitors past. She did not yet see the whole pattern, but she recognized the beginnings of one, faint though it might be, waiting patiently for the right eye to bring it into focus. Miss Marple did not hurry her steps as she turned from the widow's gate and walked toward the high street, but her mind moved quickly. Each small remark overheard at shop counters, each detail glimpsed at the periphery of the crime scene, slid quietly into place like beads on a string. She knew from long practice that to speak too soon was to scatter a flock of truths before they had time to settle. Better to wait and listen, appearing harmless and vague, while human nature revealed itself by its own clumsy movements. At the post office she paused to buy a sheet of stamps she did not need, for there was always talk at the post office. Behind the counter, Miss Reed leaned forward conspiratorially, lowering her voice to a rasping whisper. "They say it weren't no burglary at all. They say she was expecting somebody. Window open, lamp burning, tray laid with tea as if for two. Isn't that peculiar?" Miss Marple made a soft sound of mild agreement, her fingers folding the stamps as neatly as a prayer card. "Quite unusual, my dear. Though one does sometimes leave a lamp for a late caller, especially if that caller is known." Her eyes twinkled with an almost imperceptible interest. "Did you notice who posted letters to Mrs. Prouse this week?" "Oh, nothing special," Miss Reed said, though her cheeks pinked. "Just one from London, hand-addressed. No return, mind you. Looked like a gentleman's hand, firm but elegant. Arrived 2 days ago." Miss Marple thanked her, tucked the stamps away, and walked out into the thin autumn sunlight. A letter from London 2 days before the widow's death. A tray for two. A window left open at midnight, each a small, polite signal in the quiet grammar of human affairs. She continued her circuit of the village as if on a casual errand, but her eyes moved like a bird's, light and swift. Near the green she encountered young Mary Prouse, the widow's niece. Pale with fatigue and clutching a handkerchief, the girl had been called down from Bath that morning, and the shock had not yet settled in her. Miss Marple greeted her with gentle sympathy. "My dear, you must be quite undone. Your aunt was a lady of admirable habits." Mary looked up, her eyes rimmed red. "She was frightened these last weeks," she said suddenly, as though the words had burst from a dam. "She didn't tell me why in her letters, but she wrote about someone pressing her. She was thinking of changing her will. She told me only last Sunday, but made me promise not to repeat it." The girl swallowed hard. "I didn't think—" There, Miss Marple murmured, laying a soft hand on the girl's arm. "Sometimes promises are made to ease the heart rather than to keep a secret forever." "Did she say who was pressing her?" Mary shook her head miserably. "No name. Only that he was once a friend of Uncle's and had come back from the colonies with schemes. She called him dangerous but charming. She didn't even want the servants to know." The girl's voice faltered, and she excused herself. Miss Marple watched her go with a thoughtful expression. Dangerous but charming, back from the colonies, and now gone from sight while a letter from London arrives 2 days before a death. It was a sketch, still faint on the page, but the outline of a man could be seen. At the corner of the lane, Constable Pritchard came hurrying after her, his notebook flapping. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple," he said, catching his breath. "We found something odd in the scullery at Mrs. Prouse's. A man's glove, leather, rather expensive, left hand only. Doesn't belong to any of the staff." "How curious," Miss Marple said mildly. A single glove is such an inconvenient thing to mislay, don't you think? It suggests either a hasty departure or a deliberate message. She looked at him kindly. Do take care to dust it before anyone handles it. The faintest mark can sometimes be as telling as a loud confession. The constable nodded solemnly, though his brow furrowed. Miss Marple continued her walk, her knitting bag swinging at her side, and turned into a narrow footpath that led to the back of the widow's garden. There she paused beneath a yew hedge, her gaze sweeping the window where Mrs. Prouse had last been seen. A faint scuff of boots marked the soil below, too large for a woman's shoe, too recent to be weathered, and a stub of dark wax lay in the grass, a sealing wax the color of dried blood. She stooped and picked it up delicately, turning it in her palm. By the time she returned to her cottage, dusk had begun to fall, and the village lamps were being lit one by one, their glow soft in the mist. She settled at her little table, laid out her knitting with apparent serenity, and let her mind walk back through the day. Letter from London. Glove in the scullery. Wax beneath the window. Tray for two. Frightened niece. A man from the colonies with schemes. She thought of the ways a person might press a lonely widow threat of exposure, appeal to sentiment, or promise of profit. She thought of how a letter could summon a meeting, how an open window could signal consent or fear, how a single glove might be a careless slip or a deliberate plant. Slowly, as she set her needles clicking, the pattern grew clearer. Not complete, not yet, but the stitches were forming, neat and inexorable, drawing the true shape of the night at the window. When a knock came at her door, she called, "Come in," without surprise. It was the vicar's wife, Mrs. Chalmers, bringing a covered dish of stew and a fresh stream of gossip. "Have you heard, Miss Marple? They say the cousin from Exeter is arriving tomorrow to claim the estate, and someone swore they saw a tall gentleman leaving the late train last night, coat collar up, hat down over his eyes. Could it be connected?" Miss Marple thanked her for the stew, her face all gentle lines of interest. "One never knows, Mrs. Chalmers. One never knows until one looks closely enough." As soon as the door closed, she sat back, letting her knitting rest in her lap. In her mind's eye, the tall figure from the late train walked across the green to the widow's house, a leather glove in his pocket and sealing wax to hand. She could almost hear the faint rattle of a teacup, the startled cry, the crash of china on the hearthrug. Her lips curved in the slightest smile, not of pleasure, but of recognition. She had seen this kind of thing before, though no two tragedies were ever exactly alike. Tomorrow, she thought, she would ask Constable Pritchard for a quiet word, and perhaps pay a visit to the solicitor who managed Mrs. Prouse's affairs. There were still questions to ask, little ones that seemed trivial but often opened doors larger than anyone expected. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour. Miss Marple rose, drew her curtains, and placed the bit of sealing wax carefully beside the stamps on her writing desk. It gleamed darkly under the lamplight. A small, silent clue waiting for its moment to speak. The village might still be guessing at burglars and quarrels, but in her calm, watchful mind, the outline of the truth had begun to take its inevitable form, each piece linked to the next, like the quiet ticking of a clock that no one else hears until it strikes. Morning came with a pale drizzle that blurred the outlines of street, Aldhelms, making the cottages seem like figures behind a veil. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and sat at her small desk writing a brief note to the solicitor who handled Mrs. Prouse's affairs. The sealing wax she had found lay beside her blotter, dark as dried blood against the ivory paper. She did not stare at it, but let her fingers rest near it as she thought. A letter from London, a glove in the scullery, wax under the window, a niece who spoke of pressure, and a man from the colonies. Each piece was distinct, but together they hummed with a quiet tension. She folded the note neatly, addressed it, and set it aside for the mid-morning post. After breakfast, she walked to the high street under her umbrella. Villagers nodded with strained courtesy, their curiosity barely concealed. Mrs. Bartlett was already outside her shop, polishing the window, her eyes darting to every passer-by. "Terrible business," she called. "They say the inquest may be next week. Imagine." Miss Marple murmured sympathy and continued on, but she noticed the baker's delivery boy, leaning against the doorframe, listening with exaggerated nonchalance. Children were often overlooked by gossipers, but children saw and heard much. When she caught his eye, he shifted uneasily. "You're out early, Bobby," she said kindly. "Did you pass the station last night?" "Yes, ma'am," he admitted, glancing around. "I was fetching a parcel for Mr. Bartlett. I saw a tall gent getting off the late train. Black coat, brown case. He walked quick, like he knew where he was going." "Did you happen to notice which way?" she asked softly. He pointed down the lane that led toward the Green and Mrs. Prowse's house. "Didn't think nothing of it till this morning." Miss Marple thanked him and gave him a coin for his trouble. She walked on, her umbrella tapping lightly on the wet cobbles, and turned her mind to the tall man with the brown case. A visitor arriving quietly at night, a window open, tea laid for two. It had the shape of a meeting arranged, but not one expected to end in death. She wondered what had been said between them before the crash of China. At the post office, she left her note for the solicitor and purchased a single envelope of thick paper. Miss Reed leaned forward again, eager to share. "There's talk of changing the will, Miss Marple. Some cousin stands to gain, but nobody knows the details. The vicar's wife says the papers were with Mr. Carfax, the solicitor. Imagine the stir if they were altered." Miss Marple's eyes stayed mild. "Indeed, wills are delicate things. People sometimes forget how much feeling can gather around them until it bursts." She paid for the envelope and stepped back into the drizzle. By noon, she had arranged to call on Constable Pritchard under the pretext of delivering some knitting for his ailing mother. He greeted her with shy gratitude, clearly aware she had something else on her mind. In his small office, he laid the leather glove on the desk. "Clean as a whistle," he said. "No marks, no initials, just one glove. Do you think it means something?" "It may mean several things," Miss Marple replied gently. "Sometimes a glove points to carelessness, sometimes to vanity, and sometimes to someone who wishes us to think exactly that." She took from her bag the stub of sealing wax. "I found this below the window. Did you search for any papers that might have been sealed with such wax?" Pritchard frowned. "We've gone through her desk. No sealed letters. Then perhaps it sealed something that left the house," Miss Marple murmured. "A letter or a document, perhaps." She rose, smoothing her skirt. "You have been most kind, Constable. I believe I shall pay a call on Mr. Carfax this afternoon." The solicitor's office smelled of old leather and pipe smoke. Mr. Carfax, a pale man with careful hands, greeted her with the politeness reserved for respected parishioners. "A sad case, Miss Marple," he said. "Mrs. Prowse was a valued client. She had asked me to draw up a New Testament, but she had not yet signed it." Miss Marple listened with downcast eyes. She was thinking of altering her legacies. Indeed, a substantial change. She meant to leave the bulk of her fortune to her niece Mary, cutting out a certain Mr. Gideon Crane, an old business associate of her late husband. She had grown suspicious of him, she said. Miss Marple's fingers moved slightly on her handbag. "And did Mr. Crane know of this intention?" "I cannot say," Carfax replied, but his gaze flickered. "He was in London, as far as I know." "London is not so far from Street Aldhelms," Miss Marple said mildly, "especially by the late train." She thanked him and rose. "Do keep the draft of the new will safe. It may soon prove very important." When she stepped back into the street, the drizzle had thinned to a mist. She walked slowly, letting her mind arrange the day's findings. Gideon Crane, back from the colonies with schemes. A letter from London 2 days before. The widow's fear. The tea for two. The glove. The sealing wax. Each clue no longer drifted like autumn leaves, but aligned, pointing to a single path. She felt a small weight of inevitability settle over her thoughts, the sense of a puzzle almost finished. As evening drew on, she invited Mary Prowse to tea at her cottage. The girl came, her hands trembling slightly around her cup. "You wanted to see me, Miss Marple." "Yes, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "I thought you might like a little quiet company. Death brings not only grief but confusion. One forgets to eat. One forgets to think clearly." She poured the tea and added, almost idly, "I understand your aunt was considering changing her will." Mary's eyes widened. "How did you?" "Yes, she told me. She said Mr. Crane had threatened to expose something from Uncle's past unless she invested in his new venture. She wanted to cut him off entirely." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And yet she invited him to her house at midnight." "I begged her not to," Mary whispered. "She said she would give him one last chance to withdraw his demands. She thought she could appeal to his better nature." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Ah, that explains a great deal." She set down her cup and studied the girl's pale face. "Did your aunt mention where she kept the draft of the new will?" "In her desk drawer," Mary said. "Locked. It is no longer there," Miss Marple murmured. "But the wax from a seal lies beneath the window, and a glove from a man's hand sits in the scullery. People think evidence speaks loudly, but it whispers if one listens." She rose and placed a gentle hand on Mary's shoulder. "I believe, my dear, the truth is nearly clear. Tomorrow we shall speak with Constable Pritchard together. Until then, you must try to rest." After the girl left, Miss Marple drew at the curtains and returned to her knitting. The rain had stopped, and the lamps outside glimmered in the damp street. In her lap the wool grew into a neat pattern, each stitch like a fact in the case. She could almost hear Mrs. Prowse's soft voice. See the tall man stepping from the late train. Feel the tension of a meeting meant to be private and ended in death. She thought of Gideon Crane, his charm, his threats, his schemes, and of how pride can make a man careless. She thought of the glove, the sealing wax, the missing draft, and at last she thought of the widow at her midnight window, waiting with a tray for two. The picture was nearly complete now, the shapes distinct in the quiet lamplight of her mind. Tomorrow would bring the test, the moment when the murderer, thinking himself safe, would show his hand. A grey dawn lifted itself over Street Aldhelms like the slow raising of a theatre curtain. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple finished her breakfast with the same calm precision as every morning, though a keen light rested in her eyes. She had already spoken with Constable Pritchard by telephone and arranged to meet at Mrs. Prowse's house. The time had come, she thought, to let the scattered pieces of the puzzle fall into their true positions. When she stepped out, the village smelled of damp stone and coal smoke. Mary Prowse waited for her at the gate, pale but composed, her coat buttoned tight. "You're certain this will help?" she asked softly. "It will help to bring clarity," Miss Marple replied. "Clarity is always kinder in the long run than confusion." She took the girl's arm gently, and together they walked toward the widow's house. Constable Pritchard was waiting inside the parlor, hat in hand, the leather glove sealed in a paper envelope on the table. The room had been tidied but not yet stripped of its tragedy. The scent of spilt tea still lingered faintly near the hearth. Miss Marple's eyes traveled over the familiar details: the high-backed chair, the lace curtains, the faint mark on the carpet where something heavy had once rested. "I believe Mr. Crane will arrive shortly," she said mildly. "I sent him a note this morning suggesting that certain documents of interest to him had been found. One must provide an inducement, Constable, if one hopes for punctuality." Pritchard's eyes widened. "You mean he's coming here?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and we shall all be very polite." She moved toward the window where Mrs. Prowse had last been seen. "You have kept the room as it was?" "As best we could," Pritchard answered. "Nothing removed except the body." Miss Marple bent, her gloved fingers touching the sill where the paint had chipped. She spoke, almost as if to herself. "A woman waits by her window. A man arrives from the late train. A glove is left in the scullery. Sealing wax under the hedge. So many small courtesies, so many small mistakes. She straightened and turned back to Mary. Did your aunt ever keep a revolver in the house? Mary blinked. Number. She disliked firearms. Ah, Miss Marple murmured, as though that settled something in her mind. The sound of a motor car pulling up outside drew all their eyes. Through the lace curtains they saw a tall man step out, a man in a black coat with a brown case. He paused, adjusted his hat, and walked briskly to the door. Pritchard stiffened, but Miss Marple only folded her hands calmly before her. "Good morning, Mr. Crane," she said when he entered. "How kind of you to come on such short notice." He was a striking man in his late 50s, his hair silver at the temples, his manner confident, but not quite at ease. "Your note intrigued me," he said. "Documents, you said. I confess I am anxious to clear up any misunderstandings about poor Mrs. Prowse." "Of course," Miss Marple said with grandmotherly warmth. "Do sit down. We have tea." Crane hesitated, then lowered himself into the chair near the hearth, the very chair where the widow's body had been found. His eyes flicked briefly to Mary, then to the constable. "I am sorry for your loss," he said. Mary's hands clenched in her lap. "My aunt was afraid of you," she whispered. He gave a small, rueful smile. "Afraid? My dear girl." She misunderstood. Business proposals can sound harsh, but there was never any threat. Miss Marple poured the tea with unhurried grace. "Business can be a very strong word in a quiet village," she said, "especially when one mentions the past. Your ventures in the colonies were not always as successful as you hoped, were they, Mr. Crane?" His eyes narrowed slightly. "I see you've been listening to gossip." "Gossip can be mistaken," Miss Marple agreed, "but human nature seldom island." She set the teacup before him. "For instance, a man who writes a letter sealed with dark wax rarely thinks to dispose of the stub, or a man who removes a will from a desk rarely realizes a single glove has slipped from his pocket." Crane's hand, reaching for the cup, stilled for a fraction of a second. It was only a fraction, but in Miss Marple's keen gaze it was enough. She tilted her head gently. "You left Street Aldhelms on the morning train, didn't you? Before anyone knew she was dead." Crane began, then gave a short laugh. "Surely you're not accusing me? I came to discuss a business matter." She grew agitated. "We quarreled." She tripped and struck her head. "It was an accident." Mary gave a low cry. Pritchard moved forward, but Miss Marple raised one hand. "And yet," she said softly, "an accident does not usually require the removal of a draft will or a hasty departure at dawn, nor does it leave sealing wax beneath a window. You pressed her for money, Mr. Crane, and when she refused, you threatened to expose some indiscretion of her late husband's. She summoned you, or for a final confrontation. When she told you she was cutting you out of her will, you lost your temper. The tray fell, the china broke, and in your anger you struck her. Afterward you took the draft and fled, but not before leaving behind the glove that will hang you as surely as any rope." Crane's face had grown grey. "You have no proof," he said hoarsely. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, almost sorrowful. "But I do. Constable Pritchard has the glove. The solicitor has the draft of the new will's instructions, which name you explicitly. And Mary here can testify to her aunt's fear. There is also the station porter, who saw you board the morning train carrying a brown case that matched the one you carry now." Crane's hand trembled on the teacup. Then, as if some inner string had snapped, he set it down with a clatter. "She goaded me," he muttered. "Always so righteous, treating me like a beggar. I meant only to frighten her. She wouldn't listen." Pritchard stepped forward and laid a firm hand on his shoulder. "That will do, sir." Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. Her face showed no triumph, only a quiet sadness. "Pride is a dangerous companion, Mr. Crane," she said. "It makes one think he can tidy away consequences as easily as crumbs from a tablecloth. But consequences, like crumbs, have a way of clinging." Outside, the drizzle had stopped, and a pale sun glimmered over the rooftops. Mary sat very still, her eyes closed, as if listening to some sound only she could hear. Miss Marple moved to her side and rested a hand lightly on her shoulder. "It is over now, my dear," she said softly. "The rest belongs to the law." The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, a quiet metronome marking the end of a long, hidden story. Miss Marple looked once more at the window where the widow had stood, her face pale in the lamplight, waiting for a meeting she had hoped would free her from fear. Then she turned away, her expression composed, already thinking of the roses she would prune that afternoon. Human nature, she reflected, was endlessly predictable and endlessly surprising, and each small village secret was only another pattern in the great tapestry of life she had spent her years observing. By the time Mr. Crane had been escorted from the house, the village had already begun to stir with whispers. Through the curtains of neighboring cottages, faces peered out, eager to know why a tall, silver-haired stranger had been led away by the constable. Miss Marple lingered in the empty parlour a little longer, letting the hush settle around her. She did not rush. She never did. The room felt different now, its menace dispersed like smoke after a fire. The teacup Crane had abandoned still trembled faintly on its saucer, a last echo of the man's agitation. Mary sat on the sofa, twisting her handkerchief. "I can't believe it's over," she said in a low voice. "All these weeks Aunt Emmeline was so afraid, and I never guessed how close the danger really was." Miss Marple turned toward her with a small, compassionate smile. "Fear often grows in silence, my dear. Your aunt hoped to manage it alone. She was brave, but sometimes bravery blinds us to the help we might seek." She picked up the stub of sealing wax from the mantel where she had placed it earlier and slipped it back into her bag. "Now the worst is past, but there are still threads to be tied before the pattern is quite complete." Constable Pritchard re-entered, his boots damp from the drizzle outside. "We've got Mr. Crane settled at the station," he said. "He's not saying much more, but he didn't resist." He hesitated, looking at Miss Marple with genuine respect. "You were right about him all along, ma'am. I wouldn't have seen half of what you did." Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "You've been very obliging, Constable. You kept the scene undisturbed, which is more than many manage." It gave the truth a chance to breathe. She walked slowly around the room, her fingers trailing lightly along the edge of a sideboard. "Do make sure the brown case is taken into evidence. There may yet be papers inside that confirm his motive." Pritchard nodded and left again. Miss Marple paused at the window, looking out across the green where wet leaves glistened under the faint Sunday. The stillness of the village, after such upheaval, always touched her like the hush after a sermon, when listeners have not yet risen from their pews. She thought of the widow standing here 2 nights before, waiting for a man she once trusted, hoping to end a threat quietly. Human hopes were tender things, easily bruised. Mary rose, pulling her coat tighter. "I feel as though I should be angry, but mostly I'm just tired." "That is natural," Miss Marple said softly. "Anger may come later, or it may not come at all. What matters is that your aunt's wishes will now be respected. Mr. Carfax still holds the draft of her new will, and with your testimony it will stand as evidence of her intent. The court can see to the rest." She touched the girl's arm lightly. "Would you care to walk back with me? The air will do you good." They stepped out together into the street. The drizzle had stopped entirely, leaving a clear, cold brightness on the cobblestones. Villagers who had been lurking behind curtains now appeared openly, sweeping steps or fetching wood, but their eyes followed the 2 women. Miss Marple nodded to each with calm courtesy, as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. As they reached the edge of the green, Mary asked in a tentative voice, "How did you know he would come back?" "He could have stayed in London." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "Pride, my dear. It makes people reckless. He thought he had hidden every trace. But a glove, a stub of wax, a porter at a station, such things seem trivial until they line up together. When he learned the police were interested in the documents he took, his vanity told him he could retrieve them, and still keep his dignity. Vanity is a very obliging ally to the truth. Mary managed a faint smile. I suppose you've seen a great many like him. A great many, Miss Marple agreed. But each story is a little different, and each heart a little more complicated than it first appears. She slowed her steps as they reached her cottage gate. Come inside for a moment. I have a pot of broth on the stove. Inside, the little sitting room smelled of thyme and knitting wool. Miss Marple set Mary by the fire and poured the broth into a cup, then sat opposite her with her needles. For a while they were both silent except for the click of knitting and the faint crackle of the hearth. Outside, the rain-washed village resumed its quiet rhythm, as though nothing had been disturbed. Mary studied her hands. "Do you ever grow tired of it?" she asked at last. "Seeing the worst of people?" Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "I don't see the worst," she said gently. "I see people trying to hide their worst, which is rather different. Underneath, there's usually some small longing for decency, even in men like Mr. Crane. That longing, neglected, turns sour and becomes what we call crime. But if one can understand the longing, one can see the shape of the deed." The girl nodded slowly, absorbing this. The firelight threw soft shadows across her face, making her look younger. Miss Marple thought she would recover in time. Youth had a way of stitching itself back together. She herself had long ago learned to let such stories pass through her without leaving bitterness. A knock sounded at the door. It was Constable Pritchard again, hat in hand, but this time his face held relief. "We found the draft will in Crane's case, ma'am," he said, "and letters matching the wax stub. Everything lines up exactly, as you said." "Excellent," Miss Marple said, setting her knitting aside. "Then the law may proceed without delay." She rose and poured him a cup of tea. "Do sit, Constable. You've earned it." He looked embarrassed but accepted. "Never thought a quiet village like this could hold such goings-on," he muttered. "I suppose you did, though." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "One should never underestimate a quiet village, Constable. It's a stage like any other, and human nature will play its parts wherever it finds itself." Mary gave a small, weary laugh at that. The tension in her shoulders eased for the first time since the night of her aunt's death. They drank their tea in companionable silence. Outside, the bell of street. Aldhelms began to toll the hour, each note drifting across the damp rooftops like a benediction. Miss Marple listened, her hands folded in her lap, and thought of the widow at her midnight window, of how fear had crept in by degrees until it took shape in a single fatal encounter. Yet even in such endings there was a kind of order, an order she had learned to recognize and quietly set right, one small stitch at a time. When Mary rose to leave, Miss Marple accompanied her to the door. The street was empty now, the puddles drying under a shy Sunday. "Go home and rest, my dear," she said. "You've done what was needed." Mary squeezed her hand. "Thank you for everything." Miss Marple watched her walk away, then closed the door softly. She returned to her chair, picked up her knitting, and resumed her work. The pattern on her needles had reached its final rose, a simple design but neat and complete. She smiled to herself, not at the triumph of catching a criminal, but at the quiet restoration of balance, a small corner of the world set right again, if only for a while. Underscore 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 underscore. Late that evening the village green lay hushed beneath a silver mist, the cottages darkening one by one, the lamps were extinguished. Miss Marple sat by her fire, the last rows of her knitting nearly finished, and listened to the distant chime of the church clock. The day's events had left a soft echo in her mind, like the fading vibration of a bell after it is struck. She had no doubt that the law would now take its course. Mr. Crane's confession and the documents in his case were enough to secure a conviction. Yet she also knew that the surface of a case often concealed one final ripple before it stilled. Her telephone rang, a discreet, hesitant sound in the quiet room. She lifted the receiver. It was Mr. Carfax, the solicitor. "Miss Marple," he said, "I thought you should know." We have opened the rest of Mr. Crane's case. In addition to the draft will, there were several letters of a very compromising nature regarding Mrs. Prowse's late husband's investments. It appears Crane had kept them for years as a means of leverage. They will explain his threats. Thank you, Mr. Carfax, Miss Marple said softly. It is as I expected. Please see they are handed to the constable. She replaced the receiver and sat for a moment with her eyes half closed. The last shadow behind the tragedy had shifted into place. The long thread of blackmail stretching from the colonies to street Aldhelms, hidden beneath polite letters and sealed wax. A knock came at the door. It was Mary, her face pale but calmer than before. I couldn't sleep, she admitted. I kept thinking of Aunt Emmeline at that window. It felt wrong to be alone. Miss Marple welcomed her in and guided her to the chair nearest the fire. Sit down, my dear. It's natural to feel unsettled. After a storm, the mind takes time to find its footing again. She poured her a cup of warm milk and watched as the girl's hands steadied around it. I still don't understand how you knew everything, Mary said after a while, when all I could see was confusion. Miss Marple smiled, faintly. It isn't magic, child. It's only paying attention. When your aunt spoke of fear but refused to say from whom. When a letter from London arrived and a window stood open at midnight. When a glove and sealing wax were found, but no burglaries reported. All those small pieces whispered the same name. One only had to listen without rushing to judgment. Mary gazed at her with a kind of shy admiration. Do you ever feel sorry for them, the people you catch? Often, Miss Marple said, her needles resuming their gentle click. But sympathy need not prevent justice. If anything, it helps one see the truth without malice. Mr. Crane had a choice to walk away. He chose instead to strike. That choice was his own. They sat in silence for a time, the fire casting gentle shadows across the rug. Outside, the mist pressed softly at the windows, muffling the world. Then Mary spoke again, more hesitantly. There's one thing still bothering me. Aunt Emmeline told me she had hidden something to protect me. She said if anything happened to her, I'd know where to look. But I can't find it. Miss Marple's knitting paused. What sort of thing? She didn't say. Only that it would prove her intentions. Miss Marple considered, her eyes narrowing slightly in thought. Did she have a favorite book? Yes, an old prayer book she kept by her bed. Then we shall look there in the morning, Miss Marple said. A woman like your aunt would choose a quiet, familiar place. She set her knitting aside and rose. Come, I'll walk you home. Sleep will come more easily if you know you are not alone. They stepped into the mist, walking side by side across the damp green. The village lay silent, its narrow lanes silvered with moonlight. As they passed Mrs. Prowse's house, Mary shivered and glanced up at the dark window. Miss Marple squeezed her arm lightly but said nothing. Some images, she knew, only time could soften. At the gate of the niece's lodgings they paused. Rest tonight, Miss Marple said gently. Tomorrow we'll look for your aunt's keepsake. Mary nodded, a faint spark of relief in her eyes. Thank you. You make everything feel less frightening. When Miss Marple returned to her own cottage, she felt the quiet settle around her like a shawl. She drew the curtains, set her knitting neatly on the table, and prepared for bed. Yet even as she extinguished the lamp, she found herself thinking of the widow at her midnight window, of the courage it must have taken to face her blackmailer alone. In the darkness she whispered a small prayer for the dead, then lay down, knowing the final piece of the story would reveal itself soon enough. Morning came crisp and clear, as though the storm had rinsed the sky. Miss Marple and Mary met at the widow's house under Constable Pritchard's watchful eye. The constable had already secured the scene, but at Miss Marple's request he allowed them to enter the bedroom. The room was neat, the bed made, the old prayer book lying on the bedside table. Miss Marple opened it slowly. Between its pages lay a sealed envelope addressed in Mrs. Prowse's hand to My dear Mary. Mary's breath caught. That's her writing. Miss Marple handed it to her. Open it, child. Inside was a brief letter, written the day before the murder. It explained her intention to change the will, her fear of Gideon Crane's threats, and her hope that if anything happened, the letter would serve as testimony of her true wishes. It also enclosed a bank draft and the key to a safety deposit box containing the rest of her papers. Tears slid down Mary's cheeks, but her expression was steady. She thought of everything, she whispered. Miss Marple touched her shoulder. She loved you, my dear. Even in fear, she planned for your safety. This letter, together with the solicitor's draft and the constable's evidence, will ensure her estate passes as she wished. The law will see to it. Constable Pritchard cleared his throat, his eyes suspiciously bright. I'll file this straight away, Miss Marple. It will close the case tidy. Miss Marple nodded. Then our work here is nearly done. She looked around the quiet room once more, taking in the soft curtains, the view over the green, the faint scent of lavender. The stage of the tragedy had become a place of rest again. As they left the house, sunlight spilled across the village, glinting on wet leaves and rooftops. Mary held the envelope close to her chest. Miss Marple walked beside her at an unhurried pace, her hands folded lightly on her bag. She felt the village resuming its rhythm underfoot, the rhythm of gossip, errands, and quiet decency that had been briefly disrupted. At her own gate she paused, turning to Mary. This is the moment to breathe, she said softly. Let the law finish its part. Your aunt's courage has already done the rest. Mary managed a trembling smile. I don't know how to thank you. You needn't, Miss Marple replied, her eyes kind. I only did what anyone might do with a lifetime of watching and listening. She watched the girl walk away, then went inside and laid the prayer book gently on her table. The kettle hissed on the stove. She poured herself a cup of tea and settled into her chair, picking up her knitting once more. The pattern was finished now, each stitch in its place, neat and complete. She ran a finger over the rows, feeling their quiet order. Outside, the bell of Street Aldhelms struck the hour, its sound carrying clear and bright across the village, and Miss Marple sat very still, letting it mark the close of another story woven into the tapestry of human nature she had spent her life observing. The following days in Street Aldhelms passed with an almost exaggerated calm, as if the village itself wished to prove that nothing had really happened. Curtains were drawn back, shop bells rang at their usual hours, and the gossip that once rushed in loud currents now trickled in discreet undertones. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet reckoning unfolded. Gideon Crane had been formally charged and taken to London to await trial. The newspapers printed a small column about the colonial financier in blackmail case, but did not mention the little village by name. To the outside world, it was merely another crime among many. For Mary Prouse, however, the days felt strange and weightless. She visited Miss Marple each morning with papers from the solicitor, sat by the fire with a cup of tea, and tried to imagine a future beyond the shadow of her aunt's death. Miss Marple never pressed her with questions but guided her gently through each step, the signature for the estate, the arrangements for the funeral, the safe deposit box with its tidy bundles of receipts. With every detail accounted for, Mary's expression grew less pinched, though at night she still dreamed of the lamplit window. One afternoon, after they had returned from the bank, Mary lingered at Miss Marple's gate. "Do you think the trial will be awful?" she asked. "It will be unpleasant," Miss Marple said truthfully. "But it will also be brief. The evidence is plain. Mr. Crane's solicitor may try to paint it as an accident, but his letters and the draft will speak louder than his defense." She looked at the girl with quiet firmness. "You must remember, my dear, that justice is not vengeance. It is only a way of setting things back into their proper places." Mary nodded, taking a steadying breath. "It helps when you say it like that." Inside the cottage, Miss Marple resumed her knitting. Her pattern was complete, yet she kept the needles moving, beginning another piece simply for the comfort of the rhythm. The case had ended, but she felt the lingering presence of the widow's courage and the niece's Grief. These things could not be folded away like evidence in a file. They lived on in the people left behind. That evening she walked alone to the churchyard, the twilight air cool against her face. She paused by the yew hedge where she had first found the wax stub. The ground was damp, the hedge neatly clipped, the faint scuff of boots long since blurred by rain. It struck her how quickly even the traces of violence fade once the living have tidied them away. Only memory remains, and even memory softens its edges. She entered the church, its stone walls cool and smelling faintly of polish. The vicar was arranging hymnals for the Sunday service. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "A sad business, but we are grateful for your steadiness. The village might have torn itself to bits with rumors otherwise." "I did nothing extraordinary," she said, folding her gloves. "I only paid attention." Her gaze moved to the altar, flowers, white lilies, simple and unadorned. Mrs. Prouse was a good woman. She deserved to be remembered without whispers. When she returned home, the post awaited her. A note from Mr. Carfax confirming that the High Court had accepted the niece's inheritance uncontested, and a small, formal card from Constable Pritchard thanking her for her help. She placed both on her desk without comment. Outside her window, the evening mist thickened over the green, blurring the outlines of the houses just as on the night of the murder. Yet now it seemed only mist again, not menace. Later that night, Mary arrived once more, this time bringing a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "I found this in Aunt Emmeline's sewing basket," she said shyly. Inside lay a simple silver brooch shaped like a window with a tiny moon cut out of its top pane. She must have ordered it recently. There was a note saying it was for me. Miss Marple held the brooch in her palm. "How fitting," she murmured. "A window looking at the moon. Your aunt wanted you to remember her without fear, only with light." Mary pinned it to her coat, tears bright in her eyes. "I think I will." They sat together by the fire. Miss Marple poured tea, and for a time neither spoke. The clock ticked, steady and unhurried. At last Mary said, "I keep wondering if Aunt Emmeline regretted calling him here. She must have known it was dangerous." "Perhaps she did," Miss Marple said gently. "But courage often wears the face of regret after the fact. She believed she could end the threat quietly, and in a way she did. By leaving her letters and her draft, she ensured the truth would outlive her." She reached across and patted the girl's hand. "That is not failure, my dear. That is a different kind of victory." Mary smiled faintly through her tears. "I suppose so." When she had gone, Miss Marple sat alone with her thoughts. She picked up her knitting but did not resume it, letting the needles rest across her lap. In her mind, she traced again the pattern of the case, the first tremor of gossip, the midnight window, the broken china, the glove, the sealing wax, the confession. Each had been a stitch in a larger design she had only glimpsed at first, then gradually seen whole. It pleased her, not as triumph but as the quiet satisfaction of order restored. She rose, drew the curtains, and prepared for bed. Outside, the mist drifted past the window like a slow tide. She thought of how many such stories lay hidden in villages across England, each one a small knot of human folly and hope. She could not untangle them all, but when one came to her, she would do what she had always done: listen, watch, and wait for the pattern to reveal itself. Before turning out the lamp, she looked once more at the brooch on the table, its silver panes catching the firelight. It seemed to her a tiny emblem of the whole affair. The window, the moon, the silent witness to a crime born of greed and pride. She smiled softly, a smile of both sadness and peace, and set it beside her knitting. The village clock struck 9, its chime clear and deliberate. In the quiet that followed, Miss Marple felt the story settle at last into its ending, like the final row of stitches on a well-made piece of work. The following week brought the funeral, a quiet affair under a pale sky. The villagers lined the path to the churchyard, their faces solemn, their whispers hushed. Mary walked behind the coffin with steady steps, the silver brooch pinned to her coat glinting faintly like a small moon. Miss Marple came too, unassuming as ever, her presence a steadying weight rather than a spectacle. She noticed the little gestures, the way the vicar's wife pressed a handkerchief to her lips, the way old Mr. Penhaligon removed his hat with a slow, trembling hand. Each sign spoke of a community absorbing the shock of loss and returning, inch by inch, to its familiar rhythm. After the service, when the mourners dispersed across the damp grass, Miss Marple lingered by the grave with Mary. The girl's face was pale but composed. "It feels strange," Mary whispered, "as if the world is moving on without her already." "The world always moves on," Miss Marple said gently. "But that doesn't mean she is forgotten. She lives in the choices you will make now, in the freedom she tried to give you." She slipped her arm through Mary's and led her away from the grave. In the days that followed, the evidence gathered by Constable Pritchard travelled to London with Mr. Crane. The newspapers printed their brief accounts, and then even those vanished from the front pages. For Street Aldhelms, the excitement ebbed into memory. The widow's house stood shuttered, waiting for its legal fate. The village children avoided it for a time, then gradually returned to playing near its gate. Life resumed its quiet course, though with a small new caution in its gossip, as if everyone had been reminded that tragedy can bloom behind the most respectable curtains. Miss Marple watched this return to normalcy with her usual mild expression. She tended her garden, visited parish committees, and accepted tea with neighbors who now looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and awe. Yet she did not think of herself as extraordinary. To her, the case was only another pattern glimpsed and traced to its conclusion, as natural as finishing a piece of knitting. One afternoon, a week after the funeral, Mary came to her cottage carrying a small box. "These were in Aunt Emmeline's safety deposit," she said, setting it on the table. Inside lay a few family papers, the title deeds to the house, and a faded photograph of a younger Emmeline standing beside a man in military uniform. "I wanted you to see it," Mary said softly. Miss Marple took the photograph with care. "Your uncle," she murmured. "Handsome. And that must be Mr. Crane beside him before the colonies, before the schemes." She handed it back with a faint smile. "It's good to know the beginnings as well as the endings." Mary studied the photograph for a long moment. "I think I understand now. Aunt Emmeline wasn't just afraid. She was ashamed of having once trusted him." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "But shame is only another name for disappointment." She tried to make amends in the only way she knew. She reached across and squeezed the girl's hand. And she succeeded. "You are free now to live without his shadow." The girl nodded, her eyes clear for the first time. "I want to sell the house and travel for a while. Aunt Emmeline always said I should see more of the world." "Then you must do it," Miss Marple said warmly. "Go where your heart feels light. That will be her true memorial." They sat together as the clock ticked softly on the mantel. Outside, the village bell tolled the hour, not solemn now, but steady, like a heartbeat. Miss Marple poured tea, and for a time they drank without speaking, the fire's glow wrapping them in quiet. When Mary left, Miss Marple remained by the window, looking out across the green. The sky was pale blue, the hedges neatly clipped, the cottages with their chimneys smoking in orderly puffs. It was, she thought, a scene that might never reveal its hidden dramas to a casual eye. Yet behind each lace curtain lay small human stories, hopes, resentments, loyalties, fears, waiting to be noticed by someone patient enough to look. She turned back to her table, where her knitting lay folded. The pattern was finished now, its rows neat and complete. She smoothed her hand over it, thinking of Emmeline Prowse at her midnight window and the chain of choices that had led to that moment. Greed and pride had brought Crane to Street Aldhelms. Fear and courage had brought Emmeline to her confrontation. And a few small, telling details, the glove, the wax, the porter's recollection, had allowed the truth to rise gently to the surface, as it always did when one listened carefully enough. Miss Marple rose, drew the curtains, and prepared a fresh pot of tea. She felt no triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of balance restored. Tomorrow, there would be parish matters to attend, letters to write, and perhaps a new bit of gossip to hear at the post office. Life would go on, and she with it, watching and listening, ready for whatever pattern might next reveal itself in the small tapestry of village life. A soft rain returned to street, Aldhelms the night before the trial opened in London, tapping steadily at the panes of Miss Marple's sitting room. She had spent the afternoon writing a short letter of reference for Mary to present at a travel bureau in Bath, and now sat with her knitting set aside, staring at the small silver brooch on the mantel. It had become for her a kind of punctuation mark, closing not only the story of Emmeline Prowse but also marking the girl's first steps beyond the village. In the quiet, she heard the faint creak of the gate and then a knock at the door. Constable Pritchard stood there, hat dripping, his expression hesitant. "I'm sorry to trouble you so late, Miss Marple, but I thought you'd want to know Crane's barrister tried to argue for manslaughter. The Crown prosecution has his letters, the glove, everything. They say he'll plead guilty by morning." Miss Marple received this without visible satisfaction. "Thank you, Constable. It will be less painful for the niece if the matter is settled swiftly." She poured him tea while he stood awkwardly by the fire. "It's a strange thing," he said after a moment. "I used to think crime was something loud and obvious, robbers with masks, that sort of thing. But watching you work this case, it was like knitting, wasn't it? A quiet business, but one that makes a pattern." She smiled faintly. "Exactly so. Human nature leaves loops even when it tries to hide them. One only has to be patient enough to see the design." After he left, she sat alone again, listening to the rain. The village lay hushed outside, its windows glowing like small lanterns. She thought of the trial in London, how Crane would stand before the judge, the story told in brisk legal phrases, stripped of all its village shadows. Yet within those dry details lay the whole tragedy: a widow's fear, a man's greed, a girl's future. Morning came pale and windless. Mary arrived with her suitcase, the brooch pinned to her coat, and a small valise in her hand. "I wanted to say goodbye before I go to Bath," she said. "The solicitor says everything is settled now. Aunt Emmeline's wishes will be carried out." Miss Marple drew her into the kitchen for tea. "And you?" she asked gently. How are you? How are you?" "I feel lighter," Mary said, a small smile trembling at the corners of her mouth. "I still miss her, but now it's like she's walking beside me instead of behind. A window. That is as it should be," Miss Marple said. She walked her to the door, the two of them pausing on the threshold while the church bell marked the hour. "When you travel, look at the people around you. Watch how they move, how they speak. It will teach you more about the world than any guidebook." Mary squeezed her hand. "I'll remember," she hesitated. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," Miss Marple replied with a soft smile, "by living the life your aunt hoped for you." She stood at the gate as the girl walked away across the green, the mist lifting to reveal a clean blue sky. The widow's house stood quiet behind its shutters, waiting for its next chapter. Miss Marple turned back into her cottage, the familiar scent of tea and wool greeting her like an old friend. She set her empty cup on the table and picked up her knitting once more. Her needles moved slowly, not in urgency, but in reflection. She thought of the first moment she had heard the gossip the widow at her midnight window, the crash of china, and how each small detail had crept toward her like a shy confession. She thought of Crane stepping from the late train, confident in his schemes, and of Emmeline Prowse writing her final letter to protect her niece. All of it had unfolded in quiet rooms, behind lace curtains, the way so many dramas of human nature do. Outside, children's laughter rose from the green. Life had already begun to overlay the village's memory of the crime with new chatter, new errands, new hopes. Miss Marple felt a mild contentment at that. Justice had done its work, but more importantly, balance had returned. She finished the last row of her knitting and laid it neatly on the arm of her chair. The pattern was simple but exact, each stitch holding its place. She smoothed it with her hand and looked once more at the silver brooch glinting on the mantel. It caught the morning light, a tiny window reflecting the world beyond. In that small reflection she saw, for an instant, the image of Emmeline Prowse standing at her real window, no longer afraid, no longer a victim, but a quiet guardian, ensuring the future she wanted for her niece. Miss Marple's lips curved in a slight, thoughtful smile. She rose, poured herself fresh tea, and opened her curtains wide. The village lay before her, ordinary and secret as ever. A tapestry of small lives, whose patterns she had spent a lifetime patiently reading. She sat back down, letting the steam from her cup rise between her and the window, and listened to the steady ticking of the clock. Another story finished, another balance restored. Outside, the church bell rang once more, clear and unhurried, and Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, hearing in its sound the final soft note of the widow at the midnight window. The morning after Mary left for Bath, a thin frost whitened the grass on the green. Miss Marple stood at her window with a cup of tea, watching the frost dissolve under the first Sunday. The village was returning completely to its familiar tempo, the milk cart rattling past, the post office blinds lifting, Mrs. Bartlett's boy sweeping the bakery steps. Yet beneath the ordinariness lay the faint tremor of change, as if the crime had shifted the village's sense of itself just enough to leave a subtle crease in the fabric of its routines. She dressed warmly and went out for a walk, her small boots crunching softly on the thawing path. As she passed Mrs. Prowse's shuttered house, she paused for a moment, looking up at the window where the tragedy had begun. In the bright morning light, it looked merely like another upper-story window, dusty, unremarkable. But she could still picture the silhouette of the widow waiting there, her lamp burning behind her, the tray laid for two. That image, she knew, would not soon leave her. At the post office, Miss Reed greeted her with cheerful chatter. "It's been so quiet since Mr. Crane was taken off," she said. "Almost feels dull." "Dullness," Miss Marple said mildly, "is often a blessing." She bought a packet of note cards she didn't need, then asked in a low voice, "Has Mary written from Bath yet?" "Yes, indeed, posted a card this morning," Miss Reed said. She sounded very hopeful. Miss Marple tucked the packet into her bag and walked on, her mind at ease. Mary's new life was beginning. Emmeline's fears had been given meaning by the girl's freedom, and Crane, she thought, had finally been forced to confront the shadow of his own making. As she turned into the churchyard, she saw Constable Pritchard waiting by the yew hedge. He touched his hat respectfully. "Thought I'd give you an update, Miss Marple." Crane entered his guilty plea. 10 years at least, maybe more. They read out his letters in court, the ones with the sealing wax. The judge called it systematic blackmail. "Justice can be slow but thorough," Miss Marple murmured. She glanced at the hedge where she had first stooped to pick up the wax stub. "Do you know, Constable, the smallest things often carry the heaviest weight. That little stub did as much to end his pretense as the draft will." Pritchard nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "I'm learning that. You've taught me more on this case than the training school did." Miss Marple gave a modest smile. "I doubt that. You have the right instinct, and that's the one thing no training can give." She started walking again, and he fell in step beside her. "I'll miss seeing Mary around the village," he said after a moment. "She'll write," Miss Marple said. "She has courage enough for a new life. Perhaps in time she'll return to visit, and the village will seem different to her. Smaller, perhaps, or simply more peaceful." They parted at the lich gate, and Miss Marple continued along the lane toward her cottage. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. She thought of how many times she had walked this path over the years, carrying some small clue in her mind, knitting together the hidden pattern of a neighbor's misfortune. Each case was different. yet all carried the same rhythm of secrecy and revelation, of harm concealed and then brought gently into the light. At home, she set the note cards on her writing desk and drew out Mary's postcard from Bath, which had arrived that morning. A simple view of the Roman baths on the front, and on the back a few lines in the girl's hand. "I'm settling in. Thank you for helping me breathe again. I think Aunt Emmeline would be proud." Miss Marple smiled softly and placed the card beside the silver brooch. For a moment, she allowed herself a rare pause, no knitting, no tea, only the stillness of her sitting room and the faint ticking of the clock. Through the window, she saw the frost completely gone now, leaving the grass wet and green. Children's laughter floated across the green as they resumed their games near the once feared house. Life had reclaimed its ground. She rose and walked to her bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines. There, tucked between 2 volumes of sermons, she kept a small notebook of her own observations, nothing like a diary, more like a gardener's record of seeds planted and blooms observed. She opened it and, with her neat handwriting, added a single line: "Widow at the midnight window, fear, courage, pattern revealed." She closed the book again and slid it back into its place. As dusk began to fall, she prepared a simple supper and drew the curtains. Outside, the bell of Street Aldhelms tolled, the notes clear and unhurried. Miss Marple sat at her table, her knitting once again in her lap, and let the sound wash over her. Another story had run its course. Another balance had been restored. The villagers would soon forget the details, but she would remember the pattern, the way a glove, a stub of wax, and a frightened niece had together told the truth of a murder. She looked at the silver brooch one last time before placing it carefully in a small wooden box. Then she picked up her needles, cast on new stitches, and began a fresh pattern. Outside, night settled softly over the village, and in the quiet room, the gentle click of her needles sounded like the heartbeat of a life spent watching, listening, and, when necessary, setting things right. Winter finally reached Street Aldhelms, with a hush of snow that softened the roofs and hedges. Miss Marple's cottage glowed with a low fire. She sat by it, knitting a pale scarf for no one in particular, listening to the muffled quiet that snow brings. The trial in London was over. Gideon Crane had received a long sentence and, in a brief note published in the newspapers, expressed regret at an unfortunate loss of temper, but offered no true apology. It no longer mattered. The law had spoken. The village had resumed its rhythm, and Mary had begun her new life in Bath. Letters arrived from the girl twice a week, cheerful notes about a small flat, new friends, the theatre, the shops. She wrote of how she was saving for a trip abroad in spring, and enclosed pressed flowers from her window box. Miss Marple placed each letter neatly in a drawer, pleased to see the handwriting grow more confident with each post. It was, she thought, a sign that Emmeline Prowse's courage had not been wasted. One afternoon, after a walk across the frozen green, she stopped at the post office. Miss Reed handed her a parcel and leaned forward with a conspiratorial smile. "From Bath," she said. "I think Miss Mary means to surprise you." Miss Marple carried it home and opened it slowly at her kitchen table. Inside lay a small, framed sketch of the Roman baths, delicately drawn, and beneath it a note, "For you, who taught me how to see patterns." She smiled and set it on her mantel beside the silver brooch, where the 2 keepsakes caught, the firelight together like twin windows. As she sipped her tea, she thought back over the case, the first whisper of gossip, the midnight window, the broken china, the glove, the sealing wax, the confession. Each detail had seemed so small at first, yet together they had revealed a story of fear, pride, and a woman's final act of protection. She remembered standing at Emmeline's grave with Mary, the girl's face pale but steady, and realized that in some quiet way the ending had already begun then. What remained now was only to live with its echo. Even so, Miss Marple's mind returned to the image of the widow at her window. She saw not only a frightened woman, but also one who had chosen, at the last, to face her tormentor rather than yield. That choice had cost her life, but it had secured her niece's freedom. Miss Marple found a certain stern beauty in that, a testament to the strength hidden beneath ordinary appearances. Outside, snow began to fall again, drifting past the window in slow spirals. Children's laughter floated faintly from the green where they built small snowmen. The once feared house of the widow now stood empty but unmenacing, its upper window blank as an unmarked page. In time, someone would buy it, repaint the rooms, and fill it with new furniture. The story of Emmeline Prouse would become just another tale told at the post office, softened by retelling, then forgotten. But Miss Marple would remember it as she remembered all such patterns, a small knot of human nature patiently untangled, leaving behind the plain thread of truth. She rose from the table and hung her coat by the door. The little sitting room smelled of pine logs and wool. On the mantel, the silver brooch and the framed sketch glimmered side by side. She reached out and straightened them, then returned to her chair. Her knitting lay waiting. The scarfs rose even and pale as snowfall. She picked up her needles and began to work, her hands steady, her expression serene. With each stitch, she felt the quiet satisfaction of a story completed, not as a triumph, but as a restoration, fear confronted, justice done, and a young woman set free to choose her own path. The clock ticked softly on the mantel, marking the passage of an ordinary afternoon in an ordinary village where extraordinary things had briefly unfolded behind lace curtains. Miss Marple looked out at the snow one last time before drawing the curtains. The window framed the village green, the church spire, the shuttered house all muted now under white. She thought of how many windows she had looked through in her life, how many patterns she had read in small gestures and half-heard words. Each case, each life, had been another stitch in her long, quiet tapestry of observation. She smiled, a private, gentle smile, and lowered her gaze back to the scarf. In the hush of the falling snow, with the fire glowing and her needles clicking, Miss Marple felt the story of the widow at the midnight window settle finally into its place. The pattern was finished, the edges bound off neat and true. Outside, the bell of street. Aldhelms tolled the hour clear, slow notes carrying over the village, and she listened to them as she always did, hearing not just the sound but the lives it touched, the hidden dramas behind each door. She tied off the last stitch and laid the scarf across her lap, smoothing it with her palm. Another small work complete, another corner of the world set right for a moment. She poured herself fresh tea, raised the cup to her lips, and let the warmth fill her. The snow fell steadily outside, covering footprints, softening edges, making everything new. And in that still room, with her knitting finished and her keepsakes glinting in the firelight, Miss Marple sat quietly and reflected not on crime, not on guilt, but on the quiet courage of ordinary people, and on the endless patterns of human nature that she would go on watching for as long as there were windows to look through.